and I suppose to a lesser extent also provincial governments. And my colleague, Dr. Tunas Chigwata, and myself have tried to summarize these regulations in 2 articles that appear on the website of the Dullah Omar Institute as part of the local government bulletin. And just scrolling through that, I won't go into the detail because I also suppose that many of you know them very well. It obviously are a set of instructions to local government to deal with, managing the lockdown, but also dealing with, mitigating the fallout of it, and continuing to provide services and ramping up services where they are specifically needed to manage the crisis. So it talks, for example, about the need to provide water and sanitation services with a very specific instruction to look at underserviced areas. And I think we are all familiar with the massive effort that is underway and has been underway water services, in particular to underserviced areas. The use of a large number of funerals and cremations that are going to come our way, very sadly. So these are also things that municipalities have to think about, not just the limited numbers that may attend funerals and cremations that are ongoing at the moment, but also the very daunting prospect of large numbers of funerals and cremations that perhaps lie ahead. Of course, a lot of rules in the regulations on hygiene awareness, monitoring and controlling social distancing. A lot of expectations placed on local government to help with raising awareness and controlling social distancing. The much talked about provisions around municipalities being instructed to identify and manage areas that can be used for quarantine and isolation of people in high risk categories. So municipalities have been instructed through these guidelines to identify areas that can be used. And then there is a set of instructions about the provincial and municipal command centers, the development of response plans, and the prioritization of employee and health safety issues. If I can just take you to the second set of instructions, which deal more with the governance and financial aspects, and I'm just clicking through and assuming that you can all still see and follow what I'm talking about. So the rules pertaining to disaster management and particularly municipal governance during this crisis are quite interesting as well, and I'm keen to hear what the practitioners make of these rules. For example, all council meetings have been suspended, but the regulations are not entirely clear, at least in my mind, to my mind, not entirely clear on what exactly is the situation that is expected. The directions state that municipalities are still expected to perform legislative functions, such as consultation processes, the passing of budget, and the adoption of IDPs. And we all know that this is a critical time in the municipal calendar for the adoption of IDPs and budgets. But this obviously is severely impaired by the rules and by the lockdown. Now, the regulations seem to suggest that the council may meet to pass a budget or an IDP. However, elsewhere in the regulations, it prohibits the council from meeting because it instructs municipalities to suspend all council meetings during the lockdown period. So it's not entirely clear to me, at least, what exactly is the instruction in the regulations, and perhaps some of the colleagues can shed light on that. And I think what this situation also teaches us, and we're doing partly that this morning, by meeting in this way, is what does this mean for municipalities going forward, and how does it impact the way we organize meetings? And is it possible for municipal councils and committees to consider organizing their meetings in a different way, almost in the way we are organizing our meeting now? We're seeing that Parliament has started doing that and has started having its first committee meetings via the internet. And this is something that I think is new for municipal councils. And are there ways in which they can also reorganize meetings to at least continue meeting during the lockdown? But obviously this is something that really depends also on rules and orders and internal protocols and regulations that municipalities must perhaps revise to make this possible. And be interesting to hear from the colleagues what their thoughts are on this and whether this is at all feasible. The Municipal Finance Management Act has, in the National Treasury has issued an exemption. Special regime for municipalities during the national disaster was issued on the 30th of March, where the minister issued a notice exempting the municipality from complying with provisions of the MFMA if practicalities impede compliance. So basically, as I understand it, anything that the MFMA requests or commands municipalities to do during this period can be done after the national state of disaster, or after the lockdown at least. So there's an exemption issued in terms of the MFMA when it comes to particularly preparing the budgets and the issuing of monthly budget statements, etc. There's a lot of leeway for municipalities, I think, to see to what extent it needs to continue to comply with the rigors of the MFMA during the state of the lockdown. But again, a lot of uncertainty also in this area as to exactly what it means, particularly given the fact that there's not an exemption from complying with the Municipal Systems Act, and particularly the public consultation requirements in the Municipal Systems Act that apply to the preparation of budgets, or particularly the IDP. Then also municipalities have been given the leeway to pass a special adjustments budget before the end of this financial year. So if municipalities need to adjust their budgets in response to the crisis, even this year still, there seems to be a window to do so. And I would also be very interested to hear from colleagues whether that is on the cards for their municipality, and whether they are planning to adopt sort of an emergency adjustments budget within the next few weeks, almost in tandem with the preparation of the new budget. So a lot of complexities there, I think, staring municipalities in the face. Then last point I want to raise is a provision in the regulations that seems to suggest that municipal managers must be granted all executive powers of the municipality. As I think all of you know, executive and municipal manager and political structures in the municipality. The regulations now insist on a different regime during the lockdown. They sort of instruct each municipality to make sure that all decisions that would normally require the approval of the council, of a committee of the council, or of the mayor, that they must now be taken by the municipal manager, who may then only act on written advice or recommendation from the CFO and with the approval of the mayor or the executive mayor. And this only applies to emergency decisions that cannot wait until the lockdown. And any decisions taken by the municipal manager under this regime must be reported and ratified in the first meeting of the council or the relevant committee after the lockdown. So I'm very keen to hear from colleagues what they make of this. I know some municipalities had already taken such measures before these regulations came out by passing a delegation and sort of an emergency delegation to the municipal manager and the mayor. And I'm a bit concerned about this regulation. I'm not sure whether it is altogether constitutional. Of course, these are crisis times, but I think there's still a need to work within the limits of the Constitution. And it's part of an overall trend, I think, that we see not just throughout the country, but throughout the world, where democracy is put under pressure when it comes. And I'm a bit concerned that sidelining councillors and council during this this very important period, whether that is the best thing to do in terms of preserving our democracy even during this time. Because I don't think a disaster should ever become an excuse to do away with democracy. At the same time, it's very important that mayors, municipal managers and councils work out an arrangement that acknowledges the need for swift decision-making. But I would imagine that the council would still need to somehow play an oversight role. And also that the arrangement must be tailor-made for the municipality, so that there is an arrangement that makes sense for the municipality as a whole. So those are just some remarks that I wanted to make. And let me see if I can go back to the screen, if I can get it back up. So this is where my knowledge of Zoom is evading me. How do I go back to, there we go, stop share.
There we go.
There we go, now I'm back. So this was just a very brief overview of the set of regulations that have been issued. And I'm sure there's many of you that know a whole lot more about how they have landed within local government and which part of it makes sense and which part of it does not make sense. And I think it would be great to now hear from Lance. I'm also now looking at my chat box to see if there's any specific questions. We will certainly deal with some of the comments in the Q&A. So I don't see any urgent issues, but noting all the questions on the side. Is there any urgent questions of clarity, uncertainty, blatant errors? Please do let us know. I see Jonita still has her hands up, but I think that is fine. Shall we, with your permission, shall we go to Lance and hear from him, and then after that see if we can hear from Ms Bogatsu before we have a broad conversation about the impacts of all of this. Lance, are you standby? All right. Can I hand over to you, Lance?
Well, thank you very much, Yap, and good morning, colleagues. Good to see some of you on the screens. For your noting, Yap, some of us are now experts in Zoom. I literally spend my whole day on this chair. I've already broken one. And we are certainly going through extraordinary circumstances, and I'm sure we will sit a year or two from now and reflect and realize that many things could have been done better. And that is the unfortunate reality of this disaster that has essentially put a lot of things on hold, including putting a democracy on hold. From a local government point of view, certainly you would have noticed starting right on the 15th of March, with the regulation 318, that it already, they refer to it as regulations and directives, but it's essentially instructions that have been given to municipalities, and unfortunately instructions that are not followed by the necessary funding, but clear instructions that are given to municipalities to respond. And then we saw a follow-up to Regulation 399, which you have also touched on. Likewise, also placing a number of obligations. Yes, mindful of the fact that some of those obligations already existed in terms of municipal functioning, but what it inordinately did was it placed huge obligations on municipalities that may have planned to do things because of limited resources, plan to do things in the next financial year or even the year thereafter as part of their IDP 5-year plan, but those had to be brought forward to execute those particular responsibilities. So essentially, in a span of 8 days, there were huge obligations placed on municipalities. And when we certainly look at the reports that have been received, there is a positive response from municipalities. But yes, certainly there are challenges, and I will touch on those challenges as I conclude on my input. I should also indicate that part of the brief was not to have a presentation, so it helped me because I would not have had the time. But I think the conversation is more useful in the circumstances. So there will not be a presentation, but I can certainly share my notes for those who would want to access the notes. So let's zoom into some of the municipal experiences that we have picked up across the country. And the first one relates to this obligation that you've also touched on. Obligations arising today from now and could have been in the pipeline to receive those benefits, but now it's been fast-tracked. But we have seen the Department of Water and Sanitation coming on board by providing water tankers as well as tanks, which we refer to. What we are advised is that the tanks will become assets of the recipient. The tankers will remain within the possession and ownership of the department. So the biggest risk that municipalities face is that now you have tanks installed all over the place in areas where there's no water. And there's an obligation placed on municipalities to service those tanks. So those tanks must be fed with water. That is a huge implication for municipalities, both financially and otherwise, because if the water tanks themselves will go back to Department of Water and Sanitation, what will municipalities use to fill those JoJo tanks? So that's a question that is out there. We are in conversation with the national department to explore not only the transfer of the tanks, but also of the tankers to municipalities, so that municipalities would be able to, at least as a short-term measure post-COVID-19, continue to provide that service, where certainly there's now been an expectation created within communities that this will be an ongoing development for them to then have access to water through those particular tanks. So that has been the first experience around water and sanitation. The second area that comes out quite strongly relates to the areas that have been identified. So the obligation has been placed on municipalities to identify quarantine sites for isolation, but also housing of the homeless. That's been an obligation placed on municipalities, and whereas municipalities are able to quite easily, in many circumstances, quite easily avail a community hall or any other existing infrastructure to provide for such a site. The difficulty is on municipalities to provide a service linked to that particular site, including where there's an expectation created that people would be fed, receive food, and related amenities in order to survive during this time by municipalities. There are conversations that are taking place with SASA and the National Department of Social Development to ensure that funding is made available to assist municipalities in that regard. But certainly the message that is being sent is that when you look at it simplistically, is that government is in fact able to provide for the homeless in a very short space of time. And I say loosely government, but essentially the obligation is placed on any homeless person that in a place of offense, but certainly better than the one on the street, would live with an expectation that post-COVID-19, that possibility still exists for them to, as we approach the colder months of the year, they would be able to be housed by municipalities in those circumstances. So again, an obligation, but certainly a very loose legacy that would be placed on municipalities. Now, Yap has touched on the issue of council meetings. Essentially, I can indicate to you from our side, our conversation around COVID-19 really started on the 16th of March. And it is so directly after the President's announcement on the evening of the 15th about the limitations that have been introduced. We thought two things should be done. The first one is that while there are regulations issued, but secondly also because of the legislative obligations placed on municipalities to process certain matters, including your IDPs, your draft budgets, and in some instances your adjustment budgets where municipalities were not able to do so previously, but also now are obliged to consider those. How do municipalities process those? The pronouncements of the President in terms of the number of people that would be required. At the time, it was sitting at 100, so all metros were affected. But also your bigger secondary cities were also affected, where they have over 90 councillors, and if you add the officials, they would get over the threshold of 100. So a number of municipalities were negatively affected. We then said it may be best to issue regulations, and in fact went as far as drafting regulations to assist municipalities with the legislative compliance matters. The unfortunate thing is what we had developed did not find expression ultimately, both in terms of its content, but also in the manner in which we had suggested the regulations to take place. And I'm sure it will be a conversation that we are going to have post the COVID-19 when the emotions are a bit lower. We can think a bit reasonably, a bit more reasonably, and not be threatened by circumstances. But we are likely to conclude that many of these regulations would not be able to meet constitutional muster. Going into that conversation because we are still in the lockdown process and we don't want you to use your time over the next 20 days to develop a that it, whilst it is possible, it is not probable in the circumstances to have catered for every single scenario. So it cannot be that we expect that the regulations will be the solution to all. So common sense goes out of the window and we are only going to apply the regulations as it stands. The reality, the regulations as they stand is not the answer to all. It still requires us to apply both our common sense, but also the reality that there are many factors that have not been catered for in the regulations, but find expression at a municipal level. Secondly, decision making. I am aware that a lot of people, including myself, are quite critical about decision making that could be taking place during the lockdown and post the lockdown process that could ultimately get some of us in hot water. But the reality is we have to accept, including myself, that when you have municipal managers that are appointed, they all meet certain requirements for their appointment. And the assumption that we are working on is that they understand the responsibilities, they understand the law as it applies, and they would apply the law to the letter, but also within their, what I understand, their expertise within the local government space, ensure that decisions that are being made are made through proper application of both the experience as well as the law as it stands. And there is no exception to decision making under the circumstances. Any decision that is made, I'm sure all of us are aware, can be challenged. And it includes a decision that was made a year ago when there was no lockdown, and a decision that will be taken during the lockdown. And the ordinary processes should unfold where we are feeling that decision wrong and should be challenged. So for me, on that basis, a process to divert important and needed resources to wrong intentions, they should be done. Necessary PPE to be issued to all staff members. Services, but also the obligations that have been placed on municipalities through the regulations. So there's serious funding challenges. And it places strain on municipalities that also have debt to service, including Eskom and your to I know the attempt was to switch off that other mic, but it also switches off my mic. So collection levels are definitely going to reduce and will impact on the ability of municipalities to service their own debt. I will also cover municipal staff that they should receive a danger allowance. I think all of us who are in the space would be mindful of communications that have been going back and forth, but certainly it
I am no longer hearing Lance. Am I the only one that has a problem?
No.
No, I think it's.
I can no longer hear you.
Can't hear anyone.
I can't.
Can't hear Lance. No.
Let me give him a call.
Apologies, colleagues. I think there's a problem in my area. Electricity has been going on and off this morning, so it could be affecting the connection. And then a much bigger challenge has been communication, and communication, particularly from a national level, to the extent that we have seen ministers contradicting each other during media briefs. So communication has been a challenge, and I think much has been done over the last week to try and address that particular challenge. And we can only hope that communication will improve as we continue to be under this lockdown. There are also successes, but also opportunities that we could explore both during as well as post the lockdown. And it is the fact that from an IGR point of view, it seems possible for us to work across the three spheres of government together to deliver services, including using resources across the three spheres of government to provide services to our communities, because I think that for me is probably been one of the success factors, what could present with us with an opportunity to ensure that within the context of this new district development model, that we would use that as a basis for the three spheres to work together to provide services to our communities. The second area that is an opportunity is to ensure that going forward, we should have much more improved funding mechanisms, but also funding mechanisms that are able to respond fairly quickly and not within the current bureaucracy that we have. When you recently would have seen a communique from COPTA stating that there's funding available, but municipalities have 3 days to develop business plans and make submissions. So 257 submissions would be received and be assessed by who on whether they meet the requirements to receive funding. But certainly going forward, there's an opportunity for us to review our funding mechanisms for it to be more responsive, particularly in the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in. The second last area is around disaster readiness. I'm sure going forward, we would put in place much better mechanisms to respond to disasters. A criticism, and maybe I should call it a personal criticism, is I think our disaster management centers, as they exist across the country, only exist in name. But we have been dismally a failure in applying disaster management, particularly within this context that we currently find ourselves in, and it presents us with an opportunity to improve our disaster readiness. The use of technology, I think it is something that is with us, and it is something that we should tap into and use more effectively and efficiently going forward. But it requires the necessary infrastructure to be put in place. Ourselves in the bigger city centers are quite fortunate that we have access to fiber and improved networks. but the same can't be said about municipalities in the rural parts of our country. So much needs to be done for us to improve our bandwidth across the country so that this could be a more efficient way of both decision making, but also sharing information and experiences over without being in the same room or flying to somewhere to benefit from a conversation. So colleagues, those are the challenges and the successes and opportunities. And the last point I would want to make, I said I'm going to come back to, it is the issue of funding. There are conversations that are currently taking place. The SALGA NSC at its meeting on Friday considered proposals for funding, both funding from the Disaster Management Fund point of view as well as MIG funding. So whereas municipalities would have lost MIG funding, now there's an opportunity to tap into that funding for the purposes of curbing COVID-19, but also there's special funding that has been made available, and there will be a communication over the next few days around how municipalities will be able to access those funding. Let me pause there, and I can take any questions at a later stage. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Do this.
Great, thank you so much, Lance. I think that was really comprehensive and quite insightful. Before I go into the content, I think there's a request that has been made that we maybe, if we're not speaking to the group, that we switch off our cameras because it may just help with the bandwidth and keeping everyone connected. So in as much as I like seeing the faces, it may just help us to keep everyone in the meeting and audible if we switch off our videos. I'll switch mine off because I've got the floor at the moment, but feel free to switch off your camera for as long as you're not addressing the audience. So thanks again, Lance. I think a very comprehensive input. I sort of see three broad themes emerging. The one around the services and the mandate to local government through the disaster management regulations, but more broadly, concerns around the water issue. But I think if you monitor the chat box, I think some solutions also already being suggested there, and indications that the JoJo tanks will be become the property of municipalities. But of course, some of the challenges that you refer to will still be quite daunting. Taking care of the homeless, food security, I think a lot of issues that are coming at local government in the wake of this crisis. And I think you correctly raised the point, how do we sustain this? And what does this mean for local government even after the crisis has ended? So that's the first theme around services and mandate. And the second theme around governance and finance. Also picking up on the comments made in the chat box around council meetings. Is this the moment when municipalities must look more seriously into organizing virtual meetings? And some of it is already taking place. I think picking up on your comment around realism and common sense must set in, and let's not only be guided by the detail of the regulations, which are drafted in great haste and are never perfect, but that municipalities also apply common sense and innovate locally. But a real concern around the governance consequences of the crisis. Also a concern coming through around municipal managers and mayors having to take all decisions, and the sidelining of councils. And I think Dean O'Neill making the point that the mayor is already going around saying that the mayor can single-handedly change the budget. So there's confusion also, I think, on the ground as to exactly what these things mean. And I think your point about greater guidance to municipalities is very well taken. And then the third theme around intergovernmental relations and funding, communications. I'm quite keen to also hear from colleagues whether the disaster management structures and platforms are working, and whether the interaction between the three levels of government is productive and useful during this crisis at all times. I'm sure there's lots of goodwill and there's lots of on-the-ground innovation, but there may also be bureaucracy setting in again. I've heard some people complaining about the fact that we're having too many meetings and we actually need to get back to work, and all these disaster management platforms and structures are actually distracting us from what we really need to do. So different experiences coming through here. So those three themes, maybe we can keep those at the back of our heads while we continue with the meeting: services mandate, governance, and IGR. So at this point, I think it would be useful to go to Ms Bogatsu, who has managed to join us after her disaster management meeting of this morning. So we look forward to hearing from her just what your experience has been on the ground, Ms Bogatsu. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for making time all the way from the Northern Cape. Please tell us how you have been managing your side of the world in the face of this crisis. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Yap. I trust that everybody can hear me.
Yes,
hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Everybody? Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Like you said, my name is Mamiki Bogatsu. I'm from Kimberley in the Northern Cape. After listening to Lance, I thought you can just wrap up. But I've just looked at my notes, and then I'll concentrate on the issues that I think he did not necessarily touch on in our experience for the past week. But the major one of them all is that we had to abruptly halt or interrupt the normal flow of how things have been done in the municipality. I think when the president announced the lockdown, all of us were preparing for the council meeting for the adoption of our draft budget and our IDPs. Fortunately, in our instance, I think the day after the president announced the lockdown, we managed to have our council meeting, and then we passed those two important process documents. But the reality of the matter is that we are left with two documents, but there is no consultation that will immediately follow to make sure that we will then adopt the budget based on the consultation with the community. That is the reality. And then the one major issue is that we had an abrupt halt of a normal flow of income into our municipalities. If you look at our books, you'll realize that ever since the lockdown, even our community members, I still think that there are those that can still afford to pay for their services, but we have not seen that forthcoming, and that will really have a burden on our cash flow. We rely in the main on our equitable share and what and also on conditional grants. If you touch on the issue of the conditional grant, we've got the MIC funding that we are now told that we may redirect to other projects. Our biggest worry is that we've got projects that had to come to a halt, and we are worried also about the vandalism that will also come because of the lockdown. We've seen in other provinces that schools have been vandalized, but we are also worried about our major infrastructure development projects in this regard. And we are also worried that post-lockdown, are we still going to be on the same understanding on the grants that we have been granted to us, or we'll have to concentrate on what Yep. I think there's a little bit of a feedback from somebody. Please request them to mute. Hello.
Yes, hi. I'm trying to locate who it is. It looks like everybody's on mute,
Okay.
but anybody who's not on mute yet,
No,
please.
that's fine.
Please go
Okay.
ahead. Thank
All right. But the social contract between the sphere of government and the citizens is in many ways under strain. as the lockdown measures take hold with the lives of business, our social partners, and importantly, the people come to a standstill. They are all locked down. So there are specific positive outcomes emanating from the declaration of a national state of disaster, because a number of service logjams have been undone in a number of municipalities where there were patent service delivery gaps. In this instance, it will be the issues of water. As to whether we will be able to sustain the momentum of the water provision post-lockdown is one issue that we need to grapple with. We were grateful that the infrastructure will be coming to us, but at the rate that we are providing water to our communities, we're actually raising expectation from our communities that if we can put our resources together as government, we are actually able to provide the much needed services. I think that is a burden that we all have and that we'll have to deal with post-lockdown. The other experience that we had for the past 3 weeks for us is the issuing of the permits for tuck shops. It has been a very tedious process, and we have been trying to depoliticize it. We appreciate that the regulations have actually put the whole system within the LED unit, because prior to that, I think we had most of our ward councillors involved in the entire process. And I think this will also give us an opportunity to clean up our system and to make sure that those that may have in the past received those permits illegally, that we then clean that system. And then we only have people that qualify to hold those permits. But we also struggle because it's not only the permits that will make sure that those tuck shops are open. We still also have got what you call certificate of acceptability that is issued in terms of the Foodstuffs Act. So most of our communities do not understand. Some of them were even saying to us, show us where in the regulation do they say I need both the permit and the COA for me to operate. So we've actually been struggling on the ground trying to communicate to our communities that without the COA, it will still be very difficult for our community members or the spaza shop owners to operate. And we've also learned in terms of intergovernmental relations that if we put our resources together, in this instance being water affairs, we can really make it. But also, we've had in the past meetings where we had to travel from one place to the other. So the lockdown has actually given us an opportunity to test whether we can continue with the visual meetings that we are currently having. I don't even want to tell you how many meetings I've had in the past 3 weeks. But there has not been movement to what we used to call central locations like before.